Ashley Raver, ABC News, Sydney. Hollywood star couple Tom Hanks and Rita Wilson have been discharged from the Gold Coast Hospital where they've been treated for coronavirus. The couple was put in isolation at the Gold Coast University Hospital last week after testing positive for the coronavirus and getting sick. Their son, Chet Hanks, took to social media today to announce that they're both out of hospital.
We're still self-quarantining, obviously, everything I'm not there. So that's relief. I just want to say that everyone else out there who has loved ones who do yourself inflicted with the virus, I encourage you not to do it because a lot of people are suffering a little bit more pain.
Hanks recently posted a thank you on Twitter with a photo of Australia saying, let's take care of ourselves and each other. He'd been filming a biopic about Elvis Presley on the Gold Coast where production has now been suspended. The European Union has proposed a 30-day ban on all entry to the continent to stem the spread of coronavirus. In France, nationwide lockdown for at least 2 weeks has been ordered to limit social contact. Across the border in Germany, public venues and most shops have been ordered to shut, while residents have been told to cancel holidays and religious services. In Britain, people are being urged to avoid pubs, clubs and theatres, and the elderly, pregnant women and high-risk patients will soon be asked to self-isolate for 12 weeks. The head of the World Health Organization says governments must do more to test the public.
We cannot stop this pandemic if we don't know who is infected. We have a simple message for all countries: test, test, test.
Residents in Spain are making the most of being active at home, taking part in an aerobics session. The British government has been criticised for not taking as extensive action as the rest of Europe to contain the spread of coronavirus. Instead of implementing strict quarantines, the UK opted to rely on herd immunity, allowing the disease to spread throughout the community while isolating at-risk cases to prevent against a second wave of infection. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has since rejected the claim. For more on this policy, I'm joined by Professor Ian Henderson, Director of the Institute for Molecular Bioscience at the University of Queensland. Thank you so much for your time tonight. You're also a former director of the UK's largest microbiology infection institute. So were you surprised Britain chose the herd immunity?
Everyone's seen it. You know, everyone on the sky rises dancing with the chuppah down the bottom. And yesterday I saw a video of a minion on a street in New York where everyone was standing outside their house. I think they were quite far away from each other, but they had a minion. So I'm sure we'll discuss those topics tonight. But we've invited Ronnie, who is an expert in both viruses and halacha, and I think one of his favorite topics. And he's going to present some very unique, hopefully, halachot on this very interesting time. So Rabbi Figdor, take it away.
Thank you very much, Hillel. I don't know if other people will be joining still because I actually Evie's just noticed a bit of a mistake in the flyer. The flyer had 7:45. Let me start off. So we may get some more people joining within the next 10 minutes or so. I'm also recording this because I've had some requests from overseas to have a copy of the recording, so I'm recording it as well. I've turned off, if you don't mind, I've turned off your video, not because you don't look nice. In fact, you look a lot better than me. But the problem is that we're already now about 10, 12 people, and as we get more people joining, that video is likely to slow down some of the bandwidth. So you're all able to ask questions, so you're all on audio. But if you don't mind, we'll keep the videos off. In fact, you won't have to put up with my face for very long because we're going to look at a source sheet that I've prepared for you, which I'll share with you at the end. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with this technology, Zoom technology, but there's a chat. In fact, I'll send a message to you all now just to say hello. And hopefully you can actually see that chat. In that chat, I'm able to also attach a file, which I'll do towards the end of this session.
Where's the chat?
Now the chat. Now, good question. If you move your cursor and that's not the swearing type, but rather the little object on your screen around on top of the Zoom meeting, you should find that a little menu comes up at the bottom. Certainly it does on computer, and there's a thing called chat.
Yep, got it.
So there I've just typed in something to everyone. By the way, in that chat, if you're too shy and don't want to ask questions publicly, in that chat you can write directly to me with a question, and I can share it either with your name or without your name. I'll leave it to you. As I said, you won't have to look at my face for too long, because I'm going to switch in a moment to the Dept Medicine, the page of sources of text. It's a very challenging topic, and in fact we live in very challenging times. It's a very movable feast. It's changing all the time. The amount of information that's come across my desk running a Shule, just today alone, a number of calls have been quite challenging. I have to say that people who work in emergency management, as I did for some couple of decades, will know that they've rehearsed scenarios like a pandemic, and certainly the Jewish community, they rehearsed something like that about a decade ago. But when it actually happens, a lot of the things that you've rehearsed just go out the window, because the things are changing at such a fast pace. Let me remind you that you are almost all, I can see 4 people have turned off their audio, that's fine. But otherwise, the others are on audio. So if you're abusing your wife or your husband, or you have your radio or TV in the background, we can hear it. So watch what you say. If you're eating your dinner, we will know, even if we don't see you. So I leave it to you whether you want to leave on. I see a few people start going on. Yeah, gee, that did the trick. And hello, Ellie.
I was worried if I coughed, you'd all get angry with me.
That's right. So if you cough or sneeze, the whole world knows now that that's what you're doing. But I see more people are signing on, so we'll be patient. I don't think we should start formally for another 5 or 6 minutes to get confusion. But at least we've got the opportunity to test the technology.
I can't do it on my computer. I'm doing it on my iPhone.
That's fine. And Ashley, we can hear you perfectly, by the way.
Beauty. Well done.
There you go. Hopefully you can all hear me clearly.
Yeah.
I'll also say that
I can hear you.
Paul, can you?
Yes.
I'll also say that the end time is negotiable. I'd originally scheduled an end time, but let's see how we go. There's clearly, and you'll see when I start going through the Makoris, there's clearly a lot more that we can cover, and may need to cover, and maybe a second session might be appropriate, or you'll discuss some of the things with your rabbi, for example, in the event, or I haven't included this, in the event that you can't get kosher meat for coming weeks, or even for Pesach. Are there other options? So those are things we're certainly not going to discuss tonight. But those are some of the things you may want to ask a rabbi in due course. Still got about 5 minutes to go, because as I said, because of the confusion time, and I can see more people coming on now. So I apologize to all those who we misled.
While you're hanging on there, maybe I'll share something that's quite interesting.
Yes.
And Ronnie, if you're going to talk about this, then stop me before I keep going. I know that you've got a lot of information. But I was sent a article from, I think it's from a Dayan Duna.
Yes.
Is that what you're going to?
I was not going to, I know Dayan Duna, but I was not going to refer to it.
I don't know if that's a Dayan Duna we all know. But he, let me just pull it up. But basically, it was an, I don't know why it's called Rabbi Duna, but I think it's Rabbi Pini Duna. But he actually was talking about an occurrence that from the 1820s, when there was a cholera epidemic or pandemic in Europe. And Rabbi Kiva Eger, one of the famous poskim and Talmidei Chachamim, was alive at the time, and he was obviously helping all the sick people, and was later recognized by Frederick William III of Prussia for his communal efforts. But during that time, they put out a psak from all the Rabbonim about, and this is probably before they had all these government authorities telling people what to do. So this was the rabbis themselves getting together and talking about how we should have small groups. You know, minyanim should be not more than 15 people. They should be spread apart. And more importantly, not only just the physical, but the spiritual. And they had a special tehillim they said after and a yehi rotzain. And they reminded everyone to be have clean, you know, to be clean and to wash their clothes once a week, which I think was a big deal in those days. You know, they probably did it once a month, so once a week. And special foods that they should eat. They even said, don't go outside on an empty stomach. They think you should always be full. Use water to wash your face every hands. Eat some grains of mustard and take some oak bark. So it's interesting that they were dealing with quite a similar situation that, you know, 150 years ago. Really, probably the things that we're doing today is what they were doing back then as well. So this is all recorded. So I thought that was quite interesting.
Very much so. Thank you.
Yeah.
By the way, Tommy, welcome. For those people who think you've stepped into the middle of a shiur, I apologise. We actually haven't started. We've done some of the technical stuff first. We'll start in a few minutes. And those who have just joined in the last couple of minutes, and I see a few have, just to remind you that you're not on mute. That means anything you say may and well be used against you in a court of law. Certainly there are about 20 other people who will hear you say it, and it's being recorded, by the way. So if you're coughing or sneezing, this will be passed on to DHHS for evidence.
It's a good idea if everybody goes on mute when they're not talking, because inevitably everybody's got a bit of background noise, and it's all cumulative. So all these crackles that you're hearing is just the so everybody, if you go on mute, you're not talking.
Well noted. In fact, as you were speaking, someone was actually speaking to in the background. So well noted. It's probably a good idea to go on mute until you're ready to ask a question. And for those who are just joining, before we start, just to remind you, if you haven't used this technology, that there is a chat box. You can typically find it towards the screen. And if you instead of asking a question verbally, you wish to type in a question, I can handle that as well.
Yeah. Wash it anyway. Some tomatoes and cucumbers. It's already washed. Doesn't matter. I would still wash it. Okay, I'll eat later after this year.
Okay. And we've got a few more joining. Welcome to those who've just joined now. We're about to start. You're welcome to either mute or unmute. Of course, if you unmute, we can hear everything you say. And if you're telling someone that you're about to start eating dinner, we will know about it. Okay. I will wait a couple of minutes. I'm trying to be a yekker. And I said one person's name is coming up twice.
Oh, that's pretty good. Before you start, Ronnie, I want to say hello to Shia, who's listening into the shiur, your youngest member today. Hi, Shia.
Hi, Shia. Welcome to Australia. Hang on, you're in Australia anyway. We do have one person coming in from Yerushalayim at the moment.
Hello from Yerushalayim.
Hello from Yerushalayim. Thank you very much. And there I
Hello,
can see Shia. I might. Yeah, that's right. And we're just about ready. Shia, if you don't mind, I'll probably just turn off the video. The only problem I could think of a video is that if we have a few people on video as well as audio, it'll use up a lot of bandwidth, and we might find that the audio is dragging a bit. So I think we're about right to start. So the first thing I'll do is, in fact, I'm going to now go to the Dept Medicine, the page of notes. Hello, Howard, welcome. I'll just turn off your video if you don't mind. And in fact, you don't have to look at my face any longer. We're going to go through to the the sheet of sources that I've prepared for you. I'm going to minimize that, minimize this. And right now you should be able to see what I'm seeing. And this is the source sheet, and I will attach it at the end to the chat group. There is a lot to cover, and I've just, these were rambling thoughts about what people might ask, so let's kick it off. Number one, and you can see I've got here number one, are we intervening in God's master plan? So we're going to start off with some theology before we get on to halacha. A lot of people ask the question, who are we to intervene? So let's be very clear about this. By the way, it's not as clear-cut as people might think of that, because we're used to doctors intervening. And I should point out that in Shmois or Exodus, it speaks about God being the healer. In Dvarim or Deuteronomy, it says God is the one who gives life, takes it away. He wounds and also heals. In Eov, even in Gemara Chulin, it speaks about a person doesn't even injure their own finger unless it's decreed by above. And you might say, well, hang on a moment, so God's running this, what's our role? And that will take us, so I hope you don't mind, but there are some more texts here, but I'm going to, I'll refer to this one I've highlighted. The Gemara Bava Kama 85a, Rabbi Shmuel says, the words, and he shall surely be healed, rapo yerape, we read it just a few weeks ago, teaches us that a doctor is permitted. Says Rashi, our attitude, he says very clearly, attitude should not be that God made him ill and the doctor is doing the opposite by healing him. That should not be the attitude, says Rashi. But we have a great Midrash Tanchuma that gives us a story that actually helps us explain why this attitude is wrong, that God is doing something and we're intervening. It's a Midrash Tamura, rather. It once happened that Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva were strolling in the streets of Jerusalem, accompanied by another person. They were met by a sick person. He said to them, my masters, tell me by what means I may be cured. And who afflicted me? So they said, HaKadosh Baruch Hu afflicted you. So the sick man responds saying, you've entered into a matter that does not pertain to you. God is afflicted and you see to cure. Are you transgressing God's will by intervening? Whereupon the response is classic. Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael answered, what is your occupation? And the sick man answered, I'm a tiller of the soil, and here is the sickle in my hand. They asked him, who created the vineyard? He said, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael said to him, hang on, do you enter into a matter that does not pertain to you? God created the vineyard and you cut its fruits? And he said to them, do you not see the sickle in my hand? If I don't plow or sow or fertilize and weed, nothing would sprout. So Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael said to him, foolish man, just as if one does not weed or fertilize and plow, the trees will not produce fruit. And if fruit is produced but is not watered or fertilized, it will not live but die. So with regard to the body, drugs and medicaments are the fertilizers and the physician is the tiller of the soil. So the main message there is HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God has given us the wherewithal to intervene in the matters of the world, and it's not considered to be in conflict, despite the fact that one may say God has brought something on us and we shouldn't intervene. The answer is we certainly may. I'll stop for a moment. Does anyone want to ask anything before we go to number 2? And I'll just check that chat again. No, I think we're fine. So let's move on. It seems to be obvious to all of us that one should stay away from a pandemic. But in fact, not all of the Chachamim agreed with that approach, and that'll come as a novelty to you. No pun on the word novel, of course. The Rashbash was asked whether flight from an area afflicted by plague is rational because of manavshach. The manavshach is a principle that says either way, it would be the outcome would be unchanged by us. Because if one has been sentenced to death on Rosh Hashanah, That is, in other words, when the decree is given on Rosh Hashanah that this coming year, God forbid, someone will die, flight is not going to help anyway. And if one has not been granted life, one has been granted life rather, then staying in place will not result in harm. So it makes no difference, asked the Rashbash, whether you flee from a pandemic or not. The outcome is predetermined. Good question. In a fundamental study of the interplay between that, he explains that while the two prongs of his dilemma are both quite accurate, the fallacy is that not everyone is actually destined to either survive the plague or die. And it comes down to merit, and that merit can change. And we can intervene during the course of the year despite the fact that the Rosh Hashanah has passed, because there may not be absolute determination. And I should point out that there was not unanimity between rabbis about whether one should, in fact, avoid a plague and leave to another community or stay. But I'll skip that and move on to the next thing, and that is about our obligation, which comes as a consequence of agreeing that we have an ability to change during the course of the year what happens to us. So if so, what is our obligation? There are numerous verses in Tanakh. I've cited just 5 of them, but I could probably come back to you with about 30 of them. Only beware for yourself and greatly beware for your soul, but you shall greatly beware for your souls. Here's an interesting one. When you build a new house, you have to put a ma'akeh, a fence around the roof, so someone doesn't fall and have an injury or, God forbid, death. Take heed of your soul, says Yirmiyahu, and Yeshua also has something similar. So there seems to be an halachic imperative, at least in the Torah, if not in the rest of Tanakh, that we have an obligation to look after our bodies. And whatever we need to do to look after our bodies is required. We'll talk in a moment about why that is. Is it just halacha or is there a theology behind it? And we'll talk about that in a moment. In number 4, I've listed here a few verses, a few texts that indicate that it's not your free choice. Now, there was a movement some years ago about it's my baby, my choice, or my body, my choice. According to the text I'm about to show you, it is in fact not our choice. It may be our bodies, but it's not entirely ours. The first text, many of you will recognize, La Hashem ha'aretz u'mlo'ah. To God is the earth and everything that's in it. In other words, God, in fact, owns everything. So you'll say, but hang on, it's my body. The answer is yes, it's yours to look after, but it's not yours to do with whatever you see fit. And that's a basic tenet of Jewish theology, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu owns everything, including our bodies. And it's our responsibility to look after everything, including our bodies, in the best way we can, because it's not ours. We are simply the custodians of the goods that we have and the body we have, and at any point in time, God can give and God can take. And Maimonides puts this into halacha, in the laws of Rotzeach, the laws of murder. He speaks about the soul of the murder victim is not the property of the avenged relative, but rather that of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So we don't own our own lives, and therefore we have a halachic imperative to look after ourselves. Interestingly enough, the role of physicians come in fairly early. We have it in the Gemara Yerushalmi in Kedushin. You can see there that Chizkiah said in the name of Rebbe that it's prohibited to live in a city which has no physician. The Korban Ha'eda explains because one may get sick and it will be in danger. I notice as an aside that just having physicians doesn't necessarily make you healthy. I believe it's certainly rumoured that some years ago when there was a doctor's strike, and that's for a topic for another day, in Israel, that in fact the number of deaths dropped. It may be rumour, may be true. The Chida, known as Reb Chaim Yosef David Azulai, and when he lived, in his Birkat Yosef spoke about one not relying on miracles, but one is duty bound, a sick person is duty bound to seek, to heal himself and to seek assistance from a physician. I'll stop for a moment, take a breath, and see if anyone has any questions to ask so far. Good, that means you're either all asleep, that was my goal, or we'll go on. The next one, number 5, is an issue raised in the Gemara in Chulin, Daf Yud Amud Aleph, on 10a. In the Gemara there, it has a discussion about, oddly enough, about snakes and so on, and says what happens if there's a prohibition in the Torah, and by avoiding transgressing that prohibition, you put yourself in danger. The Gemara ends off that, and this is a quote and I've typed it up in English, I hope it's about right. Learn from it that danger is more severe than prohibition. Chumra maskanta sakanta li surah. Danger is more severe than prohibition. And the Gemara, that's the way the Gemara concludes, that it's more important to avoid danger than it is to avoid a prohibition in the Torah. Rashi on that place, Chamira Sakanta me surah. Rashi says, by the way, we even apply this in the cases where the danger is in a minority of cases. I raise that now because people will quite rightly argue we seem to be in a frenzy, in a panic, in hysteria over a virus that will not affect everyone. Of those that it affects, 97% recover. In fact, many of those 97% don't even realize they were sick. They had a contagion, they didn't even realize. So you're really talking about a very small proportion. Surely, halacha does not need to be overridden for such a small proportion. That's the reason why I've included this Rashi. Rashi is quite emphatic that even when the odds are low, the Gemara in Chulin's dictum that one should be more concerned about danger than avoiding prohibition applies. Number 6. There's a pasuk that we say in Tehillim, it's part of the davening, Shomer P'tayim, Shomer Hashem P'tayim, God protects the simple. That, by the way, is an important rule. The fact is that when we drive every day, we put ourselves at risk. Walking through the street, we put ourselves at risk. By the way, for your information, I looked this up beforehand, the number of people who die in Australia from influenza each year, without all the panic, is 4,000 on average every year. Why is it that why do we accept risk? And the rule is, and it's actually a Gemara, which I didn't cite here, but the Gemara quotes this pasuk from Tehillim and says that Hashem protects the simple. If people normally act in a particular way and they allow acceptable risk, Hashem protects them. So then I might say, well, if that's the case, let's not change anything halachic. Hashem will protect us as best doing what we need to do without, for example, closing down minyanim, cancelling weddings, all that sort of stuff. Surely Hashem protects the simple. A sefer called Chaim Sha'al actually addresses this because he notes a conflict in the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch actually, referring to this pasuk, in one instance says that we change the halacha because Hashem protects the simple. Another one says we don't change the halacha. So the Chaim Shal asks on the Shulchan Aruch, how do you reconcile your conflicting attitude? And he concludes as follows. He concludes that we can only apply the principle of shomer p'ta'im, that is, that God protects the simple, when the sages applied it in the Gemara. But over and above that, we are not allowed to apply this principle out of our own judgment, is his conclusion. I'll stop for a moment. Any questions or comments? No. Okay. No. Good. Moving right along. Hang on. We have a chat. Just give me one moment. Let me just see. Okay. So I hope this person doesn't mind me quoting him. David Prince has asked a good question. There's no way to avoid all risk, and that's correct. It's about risk management. What level of risk can we accept? And we may touch on that a bit, David. Good questions. May in fact touch on that a bit. By the way, I guess you've all seen, I just realized if I share the screen, you've probably seen the chat as well. Moving right along. Well, our next question really would be, has the government got a right to issue decrees? After all, there's a concept that Jews are covered by Jewish law, and there is a based in that might be a bit mute, because, by the way, if you now look at what I'm sharing with you now, this afternoon, about 2 hours ago approximately, Sydney Based In has come out with something, but assume they hadn't, and I won't share that with you yet, assume they hadn't, you might say, well, surely we can self-govern. Do we have to follow the government's decrees? Well, Rambam actually addresses that. Some of you will be familiar with a Gemara that speaks about you can avoid tax collectors and hide things. In fact, you're even allowed to, sounds odd, you're even allowed to wear shatners, which is a prohibition in the Torah, to avoid the tax collector realizing that you've got extra clothing on. The Gemara actually answers there without going into any depth, but explains that that's only talking about where you've got people who purport to be tax collectors, but they're actually self-appointed. And sorry, I'll minimize that. Okay. But Rambam actually speaks to our topic about whether the government has the right to issue a decree and that we have an obligation to follow it, and it goes as follows. The right of the government to levy taxes is restricted only to a bona fide government and does not apply to any pirate, now he uses a different word obviously, who decided on his own to rob the masses in an organised fashion. Even when it is an official government levying taxes, the system of taxation is unjust. As for example, if one segment of the population is discriminated against and is taxed more than another, then too, this principle does not apply. But otherwise, Shmuel in the Gemara formulated a policy that many of you have heard of, Dina de Malchuta Dina. The law of the land is the law of the government is binding, but says Rambam, the Dina de Gazlanuta de Malchuta, the robbery of the government, does not apply. Shmuel ben Meir actually on the Gemara of the Gemara of Shmuel that speaks about Dina de Malchuta actually explains why a government has authority in the Torah to issue decrees that are binding on the Jewish community like everyone else. And he says, and it makes an interesting observation, he says, all regular and special taxes and all decrees promulgated by the kings are law. Why? Because all the people of the kingdom willingly accept the statutes and ordinances of the king. Now, a few of you are going to raise your hand. And by the way, you can actually do that on this technology. Are going to raise your hand saying, hang on, I don't accept everything. In fact, if it were my way, I'd change a few things. That's true. But if you live in this country, you choose to do so because you accept upon yourself the rules. If you don't accept upon yourself the rules of the kingdom, then you move somewhere else. And it says, Shmuel ben Meir, therefore these are binding. I thought I'd throw in a brief comment about consulting with experts. Rabbis, claim to know pretty much everything. After all, everything's in the Torah. What, do we have to rely on rabbis for experts, or can we use our Torah or Gemara or any other texts to determine what we should do from here on? Well, I have to tell you that the Gemara is replete with examples of where rabbis consulted with experts and relied on experts. I've given you some here. By the way, I haven't listed here, but the rabbis also were involved in doing their own experimentation. They relied, there's a Gemara where they relied on a matronusa, a Roman matron, who actually would terminate pregnancies at different stages. It sounds unethical, but she would terminate pregnancies at different stages so she could study embryology, and the Rabbanim relied on the results of those experiments. So there are lots and lots of examples, and we won't read them now, lots and lots of examples where the Gemara relies on experts and doctors. So here's an interesting question. I know Yankel just came back from Israel yesterday. The new edict of the Australian government is that anyone who's come from anywhere from overseas is to self-quarantine for 14 days. As it happens, I saw Yankel this morning in Shachris. Firstly, can I speak to someone about it, or is it Lashon Hara? So let's, at this stage, I'm only proposing I speak to the rabbi who was not in Shule. Can I complain to him and say, look, I don't think Yankel should be here? Well, the laws of Lashon Hara, by the way, are biblical. Lo selech rachel b'amecha. You should not walk around tattling, I couldn't think of a better word, amongst your countrymen. Do not profit by the blood of your fellow, I'm the Lord. So there's a biblical prohibition about talking badly. And by the way, that's talking about telling the truth. Okay? It's a different halachic prohibition when one tells a lie. But there's a prohibition about telling negative stories that are truthful about someone. The Yechava Das actually says you're obligated to warn someone that they need to follow directions of health authorities. If they do not need your warning, you're obligated to immediately notify the authorities. So the answer is there's no Issur of Lashon Hara in this instance. It does raise a question of Masira, though, because the Yechava Das has touched on notifying authorities. Now, the concept of Masira has become very popular in recent years, particularly, unfortunately, in relation to allegations of child sexual abuse. And the word was unfortunately bandied about, I think, too often. So most of you know the word Masira, literally meaning handing over, as a negative. It's not biblical, by the way, it's actually Talmudic, that one is not to hand over people to the authorities. In fact, one doing so was on pain of death, according to the Gemara, and that's repeated, by the way, in Halacha in Shulchan Aruch. So let's understand, can I tell on someone to the authorities where, you know, they've done something like turning up to Shule, or they went to a wedding last night when they should have been in quarantine. And by the way, I actually do know of a case of someone who was should have been in quarantine and was at a wedding 2 nights ago. So should someone report them, or at least tell them off? And if nothing comes of it, then report them. So the Shulchan Aruch in Choshen Mishpat discusses this, and he's quite emphatic. He says, one who troubles the community through misconduct may be informed upon. If you're a public danger, the rules of Masira are waived. So too, one who engages in conduct that endangers members of the community may be informed upon. In fact, interesting, and I put this as an aside, the Aruch HaShulchan, Rabbi Yechiel Michal Epstein, by the way, it's not a mistake, it's not Shulchan Aruch, it's Aruch HaShulchan. actually clarifies that in Australia, the rules of Monsieur actually don't apply at all. So it's unfortunate it was bandied around a lot in recent years, but in fact, according to him, it wouldn't apply. He actually explains why. As is widely known in times of old in places far away, no person had any assurance in the safety of his life or money because of the pirates and bandits, even if they took upon themselves the form of government. Because governments in his time, in places where he refers to places far away, were not just and were really rogue. It's known that this is true nowadays in some places in Africa, he writes about 100 years ago, where the government itself is grounded in theft and robbery. Obviously, I won't make any comment on recording about governments in Africa today. One should remind people of the kingdoms in Europe, and particularly our rule of the Tsar and his predecessors and the kings of England who spread their rule, the influence over the men and lands, etc., should have confidence in the security. And he goes on to say that where there's a just system, then the laws of Masira don't apply. They were only applied where you couldn't rely on the government officials to act justly or in the best interests of the community rather than other than their best interests, their own self-interest. Another interesting question popped into my mind this afternoon as I was preparing this, and that is, let's say someone has infected others, but knowingly. In other words, he didn't follow the government guidelines. He turned up, let's say, to a Sheva Brachas, coughing and spluttering, and it was clear that he should have been in quarantine. And yet there he is sitting at the wedding or Sheva Brachas or whatever, coughing and spluttering, and as a result harms others or causes a loss. And I don't want to go into depth now on the difference between groma and garmi, but he causes a loss as a result of harming others. So, for example, the venue he went to had to pay money for disinfection. Interestingly enough, Moshe Feinstein on another topic I thought speaks to this topic. He refers to smokers. By the way, Moshe Feinstein was not clear on prohibiting smoking. He refers to smokers and then says they're actually committing an assault by smoking in front of others, and said that it was his view that the offended person could sue them in Beis Din for damage. So Moshe Feinstein believes that a person who causes damage to others through their breathing or through causing other without using their hands is nonetheless a damage and is entitled to, it may have to pay compensation. I'll stop for a moment. Anyone want to ask anything or comment so far? Ooh, we're getting through this quite fast. Now,
talk.
Yes, go for it.
Aren't you introducing elements of subjectivity? So, for example, when you talk about giving somebody up, if you feel that the people are unjust or unfair, isn't that a subjective decision?
Yes.
And the same applied to something earlier that you said as well, about the tax collectors.
Yes.
If you feel that they are not being legitimate,
yeah,
you know, that's you being subjective in terms of making a decision about somebody else.
Yeah. So you're right. The halacha though is replete. Yeah, no, Tom, you're right. The halacha is replete with examples of what's a fair system of justice. And Tommy, as you well know, it's actually a biblical requirement on non-Jews to have a fair system of justice. So there's a way of determining what it is. But you remember that that's one of the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach, one of the 7 mitzvahs that as obligatory on non-Jews as well. But there are examples. So Tommy, in this context, I can't give you examples, but there is an independent way of determining that everyone is treated in the same way and fairly.
Okay.
Abigail, you wanted to? No? Okay. So.
No.
Okay, all good. So moving back now to, and isn't that the same as animal danger? So I point out, by the way, that Paul has asked a question in relation to animals damaging property, and the answer is yes. But Paul, it's a bit more complicated, because of an animal that does not have a propensity for causing damage, and you couldn't have anticipated it, the liability is much less. Okay, with a human being, there's a concept that says la'olam adam muad, a person is always considered to be responsible for their actions, even unwittingly. With an animal, it's only deemed to have a propensity for causing damage on either on the third or fourth occasion. I won't go through the difference between whether a chazaka is on the third or fourth occasion, but that's when you have liability. But for a human being, the liability commences immediately. And now back to our text. A crazy one that I was thinking about, and that is, let's assume our friend, I think I called him Yankel before, can't remember, but let's assume it was Yankel. He's been warned now a few times. You're causing that. You're creating problems. You're coughing and sneezing. You've been coming to Shule every morning. You've been told to stay inside, and he says, "No, I don't think I'm at risk to anyone else, and I'm keeping 1.5 meters away. And I have been having a temperature, but I'm being careful." To what degree can we stop a person from spreading risk? And could we go all the way to killing someone who's creating a risk? Now, some of you will probably guess the answer. Does anyone want to propose one word that probably summarizes it? Anyone? The word you would know. Okay, the word I was going to suggest to you is the word of rodef. Rodef is a halacha in relation to someone who's a pursuer, someone who intends to kill another person. A third party can intervene and take reasonable measures, including possibly killing the pursuer. It comes from, in fact, the parasha just a few weeks ago, Mishpatim. So let's have a look at what that's about. First thing to comment is we have an obligation to live by the mitzvahs, v'chai bahem, live by the mitzvahs, and not die. Therefore, mitzvahs are may be set aside rather than die, with three exceptions, and those exceptions appear in Rambam in Hilchos Yesodei Torah, in the foundations of Torah. Rambam says there are three exceptions to the rule: idolatry, immorality, and murder, for which yehareg, rather be killed v'al yavor, but don't transgress. Okay, so and by the way, the Gemara explains that. Gemara says, is your blood rather than his? Why should you take his life instead of yours? Why, rather, in other words, for murder, is your blood redder? Why is your blood or why is your life more than his? And therefore, in the case of murder, rather, if someone says to you, murder someone or else I'll kill you, the halacha is rather be killed. Of course, no one should be in this situation. But the concept of a rodef, who is in Parashat Mishpatim, speaks about a burglar who's active at night, and when, by the way, he must realize that the homeowner would be at home, and therefore the homeowner is a mortal threat to him, and therefore he may kill the homeowner. He can be stopped with whatever is necessary, including deadly force. Okay, so it's the law of rodef. That law of rodef tells us that if someone is likely to compromise the life of other people, all reasonable measures, including if it need be, to kill the person, is allowed. And by the way, as an aside, we actually use this concept for an unborn fetus that is compromising the carrying mother, the life of the mother, halacha actually permits in that circumstance to terminate the pregnancy because the fetus is considered a rodef, a pursuer. And by the way, as I've noted here in Gemara Sanhedrin, the rodef doesn't even need to be aware that he's threatening the life of someone else for you to step in. So in the case of a fetus, even if clearly the fetus is not aware and is not conscious of compromising the life of the mother, nonetheless, the Gemara is quite emphatic that under that circumstance, the pregnancy can be terminated. So, yes, if someone is a serial offender and there's no way to stop them from infecting others, then all reasonable precaution steps can be taken. Everyone's asking, should I go to Shule? Now, you would be aware that Caulfield Shule, you may be aware Caulfield Shule closed its doors today at midday. They will review that a day or two before Pesach, but at this stage, their doors are closed. You may or may not be aware of the Sydney Beth Din. I said I'd refer to it. That came out now about 2 hours and 20 minutes ago, around 6 o'clock, I think it was, came out. This is a Sydney Beth Din, and it's an advisory to shuls in Sydney, but moving right along, it says, our particular concern, I'm referring to this bit here, is religious service in synagogues, etc. They've explained that synagogue is a unique meeting place, which is correct. It's called Bet Knesset for a good reason. It's where people gather, sometimes to daven, often to talk, but that's for another day. And they have issued what they believe is a halachic imperative that all minyanim, all synagogues be suspended in Sydney from now until further notice. Many of you will know that I run St Kilda Shule, and obviously it's one of the factors that we're weighing up over the next few hours, or possibly the next 24 hours, knowing that the Beth Din believes that this is a case of potential danger to life of keeping shuls open. And as we've already seen in our notes so far, even the potential to danger overrides a lot of the mitzvot. So Rabbi Risk, yes, go ahead, Hillel.
Sorry, just say the Rabbinical Council of ANZ is about to come out something quite similar. So I think it's going to be quite wide at the moment.
Yeah.
Widespread.
Now, let me just reiterate, there may be some listening, and there are now, I don't know, about 15, 20 people listening to this conversation, may say, look, this is all a bit over the top and settle down and so on. That may be true, but remember one of the texts I showed you before, it was a quote from Rashi on a Gemara that spoke about that danger overrides the transgression of a biblical prohibition, and Rashi there says even if the chance of danger is minimal, this would be a case where the rabbis might say the danger might be minimal. After all, you're talking about 3% or maybe less, but more mortality rate and how many people be affected. Nonetheless, the potential danger overrides. And this quote from Rabbi Riskin was from last week. You're aware that in Israel, they took more severe measures earlier on, and already from, I think it was Friday, I can't remember when, they limited crowds to just 10. Rabbi Riskin issued this a week ago about people over 70 should not go and daven. I've repeatedly issued warnings that one's behaviour must be in accordance with the judgment of doctors and not, I'll come to that in a moment, but Rabbi Riskin was emphatic that follow the guidelines and even exceed those. He was concerned about people who are in the older age group who seem to be at the higher risk. By the way, you can check, there's a worldometer or whatever that actually speaks about concomitant medical conditions. So it's being older is not in itself the risk. The risk is really, you'll see there on the results so far, that the risk is really to people who have another underlying condition, typically they have a chronic heart issue or diabetes, they are in a higher risk. So it's not just age, although that certainly seems to be a factor. But Rabbi Akiva spoke in relation to a cholera outbreak in Europe in the 19th century, and this is a rough translation. I've repeatedly issued warnings that one's behaviour must be in accordance with the judgment of the doctors and not violate their instructions. Which leads us on to the next thing. If, for example, and Hillel's told us that the Arcans intends to issue some sort of rabbinic ruling, and by the way, at the end of the day, where individuals will either follow it or don't, and shuls are somewhat independent and will either follow it or not, it's worthwhile considering how important is a minyan, and what are there technological solutions if we decided that the minyan's important, but we agree to abide by whatever decision the rabbis or individual shuls make. And I can tell you now, I've had calls from people from, well, I may as well say which shul, because I told you the one closed its doors at midday. I've had calls from people from Caulfield Shul asking about our minyanim and saying this is all a big beat up and it's totally unnecessary. And no doubt they're concerned about the importance of a minyan, by the way, with good reason. So the Shulchan Aruch, I realize I've got a typo there, but anyway, the Shulchan Aruch says a person should make every effort to pray in a shul with a minyan. The Mishnah Berurah there says God never rejects the prayers of congregation, even if the sinners are amongst the crowd. In other words, the concept of tefillah b'tzibur, davening together, is very powerful. All the people here are either in Melbourne or from Melbourne and know that on occasions communal prayers have been held in shuls in Melbourne for a whole lot of things, including issues in Israel. Bushfire, by the way, recently in January, St Kilda Shule had a communal prayer. There's a reason for that, and that's because the power of communal prayer is enough to break any decree. And surely that should weigh on the conscience of the rabbis when issuing their decree about the opening of shuls. So we'll read on. And by the way, the Gemara in Tainus says that even if a person's kavanah, his intention or concentration is imperfect, if he prays in a congregation, his prayers will be heard. See how important it is. By the way, here's a great one. I use this particular text sometimes when I'm speaking about euthanasia. See if you can work out why as we go through it. The Yalkut Shimoni on Parshas Ekev tells of a fascinating story about an elderly woman who wanted to die. She came to Rabbi Yossi ber Chalafta and she said, I'm very old. My life has become unpleasant. I don't want to live anymore. I can't taste the food or drink, and I'd like to pass away. So Rabbi Yossi ben Chalafta said to her, you know, what mitzvah is it that you do every day? And she says, well, that's interesting. I actually go early every day to shul, even if it means I give up something that I enjoy doing. Rabbi Yossi instructed her to stop attending shul for 3 days. She did and passed away. The message I normally use for this is different. It's normally about a rabbi giving a recipe for euthanasia. It's an odd recipe, but it also is quite instructive about the power of communal prayer. And at least in this case, it kept a woman alive. And I note that the Mishnah in Megillah says that you can't do Dvarim Shebekdusha. That includes, for example, saying the Kaddish, saying the repetition of the Shemona Esrei. There are quite a list of tefillot you can't do without a minyan. So if the rabbis and if shuls decide that we are closing down, there are things we'll forfeit. All of those, though, cannot compare to our previous discussion about now about 35, 40 minutes ago about the power of putting oneself at risk is greater to avoid the risk or danger than keeping the mitzvahs. So then one of the topics we have to talk about is there any potential for virtual minyan? Now, you're all going to say, oh, that's a load of nonsense. That's only because you're accustomed to assuming you all have to be face to face. But is in fact that the halacha? Well, it is, I'm afraid to say. But there's good reason for that. So it comes from, again, from a Gemara Megillah that it required 10 people to be in one place. By the way, there is some way around this. I'll come to that in a moment. But it requires 10 people to be in one place. The Gemara there even talks about someone standing in a doorway and is half in and is half out. Is he included? The Shulchan Aruch, and that's the one I referred to here, says that all the 10 need to be there, including and he could be one of the 10, including the Baal Tefillah or Shatz, Shliach Tzibur, all have to be there, standing in a doorway, etc. The Shulchan Aruch goes on to speak about even what happens if you're someone's actually in a bit of an alcove and it's not quite 4 meters wide, 4 tefachim wide, etc. Whether that's included, and there are times when people are excluded, but otherwise you need to be there. And this is the summary. If some of the 10 are in the synagogue and some of them are in enclosure, they don't join with each other. You basically need to be there. However, and this is an interesting point, in theory, we could agree as a community we'll have 1 minyan of exactly 10 people. They are allowed to do Devarim Shebekadusha. Why? Because the Shekhinah rests, the divine presence rests amongst them, and they can do the things. However, they could use our technology or WhatsApp or Skype or any other technology, and everyone, although we can't participate physically, we can answer Amen in the appropriate places and have almost the potential for tefillah b'tzibur. Now, I'm not giving a psak, and I'm certainly not, I wasn't asked by the rabbinate about this concept, but in theory, it would be possible for us to come to an agreement. There'll be one place where there are 10 people who either take a risk or have already been tested to be found to be positive and are careful about their practices outside of that minyan, and they get together and they share online their minyan, and we could all answer Amen. In fact, it's important that we, even doing something on our own, should be at the right time. And that's what I want to deal with now. So anyway, I've given you something to think about, the potential for a minyan in Melbourne, davening at the right time, and we all go online and answer Amen to their Dvarim Shebekadusha, the Kaddish, as I said, Baruch Hu, the repetition of Shemona Esrei, and a few other things. Clearly, Shabbos will be a problem. I was in fact supposed to speak this Shabbos on the issues relating to operating electricity on Shabbos, and I was going to speak about microphone, that sort of stuff. That shiur, by the way, was going to be given in the afternoon at Caulfield Shule. It is now not on. So you're saved from that. So what can you do without a minyan?
Question time?
Yes, please, Tommy.
Okay, so there are 18 of us plus one leader. Are we not in a place right now?
No, Tommy, no, we're not. And that was one of the things that comes clear from the Shulchan Aruch. They needed to be in the same room. In fact, there's a question whether one is standing out in the doorway, but if someone is out in the courtyard, can't it be included in the minyan? Tommy, can I say?
Clearly not, but this is very different. This is new technology.
Yes.
And clearly we are now in one place, but it's not a room.
Yes, and Tommy, we actually get merit, by the way, a separate thing, and I can see someone asking, someone wants to, okay. Ashley will ask the question in a moment. So a separate thing, Tommy, is we get merit for learning. And when 10 people learn together, and by the way, there is no limitation of how the 10 learn together, Tommy. You don't need to be in the same room to learn together. When 10 people learn together, the Shekhinah rests amongst us, and we'll get merit for learning together as a group. However, and I can see David Prince's question as well, however, the Dvarim Shebekadusha, the Gemara is clear, and therefore the halacha is clear that you need to be physically in one place. And I'll explain to you why. And that is that when I'm hearing Tommy, and by the way, I could tell it was Tommy. I recognize your voice. We caught up this morning. I know who you sound like. But Tommy, I'm actually not hearing your voice. Okay? What I'm actually hearing is a reproduction of your voice. Because what's happened in the microphone that you were speaking into in your computer is it changed it into digital form. At the other end, there's a speaker on my end, in fact, on all of yours, that's hearing a reproduction. But that's actually not you, Tommy. Now, I know it's you. And in fact, if I turned on video, I could see it's you. But what I'm looking at is not you. I'm looking at a reproduction of you, and I'm hearing a reproduction of you. And therefore, to treat it as a davar shebekadusha, I can see Bruce says it's a totally different subject. To treat it as a davar shebekadusha because we're together, unfortunately, doesn't count. David asked, are there special rules for Shat Chak? Yes, David, but certainly not to put people at risk. Okay, in fact, putting people at risk would be a Shat Chak. However, I've proposed to this small group, not to the entire community, but this small group, it is possible for us to come to an agreement about getting a minion of people together, and it could be in a shul or a private home or whatever is chosen, and it's broadcast live, and we could all daven at the same time. We all say silent Shemona Esrei together in our own homes. We wait, we answer amen to every bracha in the repetition, and we could get merit for that. Paul has asked about the definition of a room and how big can it be. It can be enormous. I was going to say, incorrectly say that as long as you hear, but you don't actually have to hear, because you'll all know the stories of the big shul in Alexandria in Egypt, where they couldn't all hear. It was massive. In fact, they had some sort of indication where everyone had to answer amen or whatever, because they couldn't all hear. It was so large. I don't know if it's the same as the Gera, I won't say Shtibel, the Gera Shule in Yerushalayim, which is also large, and they use a big clapper to get people's attention. So Bruce says, I think it's a great idea. Okay, thank you very much. I'm not sure if I should suggest it outside this group. I can certainly speak to the president of Arcans. Oh, sorry, Belzer. My wife was correcting me. I did say that Gera, I meant the Belzer Shul. Thank you very much. That's the first. I don't think my wife has ever corrected me before. So I can certainly mention this to the rabbi, the president of Arcans as an idea. I don't know if it'll float, but it certainly, I think, would have halachic basis to have a minyan, and everyone can log in. We'd have to check that the technology can cope with the streaming, because we'd have hundreds of people logging in at the same time, or create multiples of these every morning, from 7, 7:30, etc. But certainly that can be done. I think that we've pretty much done our time. I'm happy to respond. I'll just share with you one thing that I think is important, and for that I'm going to share my screen one more time, and then I think I'll take questions. So I'm going to share this screen once again. Whether we do the Ronnie Figdor suggestion of having one group of 10 people and we all log in, or people just daven on their own, and that may be what happens. The Gemara in Brachos, we actually learned it just a few weeks ago. This particular Gemara asks about, is there sha'at ratzon, is there a time of favor? And the answer is yes. The time that Hashem favors us most is when we daven at the same time the congregation is praying. Therefore, if I could humbly suggest that people who typically go to a minyan at 6:45 or 7 or 7:15 or whatever, I think should make every effort to daven exactly at that same time, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should recognize that we are davening if not quite a congregation, we're davening all at the same time so that all of our tefillahs are accepted as if we were davening in a congregation. So we should not become laissez-faire and just get up when we like and daven when we like. We should still stick to a schedule, because I think there's a lot of potential. I can see some questions coming up. Before I do that, I'll just refer you Chabad. I'm not, by the way, a Chabadnik, but they do a lot of good stuff, and this is another one of those. They've set up a coronavirus quarantine Kaddish service. I used it this morning for someone who's just had a bereavement earlier today and can't make it to a minyan. You can go online, put in a name, and don't pay anything, put in a name, and they will try to ensure that someone will say Kaddish for at least 60 days. Somewhere in the world, they'll organise that there's a Chabad minyan of at least 10 people where people say Kaddish. And now I'll take some questions, but I'm happy to, lots and lots of stuff. I'm happy to, I'll stop sharing and look at this. Happy to answer questions and then email out this, this source sheet. But certainly discuss further questions with a competent rabbi. I can foresee a day when we may need to talk about the issues of being vegetarian over Pesach, if that happens, and you'll want to get some advice from a competent rabbi. So let's see what questions we've got. Ashley asks a good question. What's the problem of davening with the minyan and keeping 1.5 meters away from each other? Ashley, in theory, no problem. It would meet the current government guidelines unless they've changed them while we've been online. Having said that, though, clearly people are nervous, and there is the potential for spread. Now, just one moment. I'm getting some feedback in Crown Heights.
It's also material.
All the people stood out in the street, says Evie. Yes, Tommy?
It's material. One of the biggest problems is material contamination. So, for example, if you are, you can be 1.5 meters apart, but the minyan before you, somebody else could have been sitting in your seat or in that area and touched either the handrails or something like that, and that lasts up to 72 hours.
That's correct, Tommy, but there are precautions. I'm not speaking as a virologist.
Disinfect the shul every time you come to daven.
Yeah, that's possible, but just to make clear, a lot of people think just touching, because doesn't actually, by the way, does not cause a contamination. Our problem is that human beings several times in an hour will touch their nose and mouth without being conscious of it. I've probably scratched a few times during this session without being aware of it. The problem is getting virus on your hand and then infecting yourself.
Correct.
And that is the problem. Could we take precautions? I suppose so, but it is a challenge. And Evie's idea of getting everyone to go out of their house as they did in Crown Heights and in the street and doing a minyan that way could work. There are some streets in Melbourne where that would work. In my street, the houses are probably a bit too far apart for that to gain any traction. Let me see if I can go through some of the questions here and then take some more. You have a minyan and then have number 11 online, say Kaddish. Paul, that's a great question. It seems to me, no. It seems to me that the person saying Kaddish has to be amongst the 10 people, because it's a Dover Shabbat. However, Paul, there's nothing wrong with appointing someone to say Kaddish for you amongst those 10. In fact, there are people who do this all the time. They're traveling and they're very makpid. They're very careful to say Kaddish during their 11 months or a year, as the case is for Sephardim. But they have to travel. They'll ask someone to do it. Sometimes they pay someone to do it. But it's certainly possible. And in fact, if the Ronnie Figdor idea gained traction, they would already announce at the start of davening, anyone who wishes us to say Kaddish, we have you in mind. You don't need to supply the names. We have you in mind. Just think of the person when you're answering Amen. We'll have them in mind. Bruce has got something here. I read somewhere the number of chats was set up and shut off as a certain number. Okay. Not sure about chats being shut off. Bruce, I'm not sure if I've understood, but certainly online chats unlikely to be contaminated that way. And if we have problems, says Bruce, I'm trying to read this as fast as I can. If we have problems properly making Pesach, there will be. Now, I'm supposed to run a communal Seder. That's on hold now. May not happen because the communal Seder was supposed to happen in Shule. However, I should point out that Pesach Steinberg, no play on words, Pesach Steinberg is planning to cook the food and make it available to anyone who's booked. So you'll be able to do that. I know that passionate and an increasing number of caterers, kosher caterers in town are making preparations. So you may not be familiar with running the Seder, and there might be we might use technology to give you a few tips in the next few weeks, but certainly, hopefully there won't be an absence of food that's prepared for you. Michelle Golding has asked a brilliant question, which I covered off when I was running JEMP, Jewish Emergency Management Plan for Victoria. How are we dealing with funerals during this pandemic? I can't respond to that because I'm no longer involved in the community's management plan. It is certainly something that we discussed. We had in a pandemic scenario we did about a decade ago. Ephraim Finch, who was then still running Chevra Kadisha, was part of that plan, and we spoke about then what they were doing. As I said, I no longer am involved in that aspect in the community. I'm sure I hope someone has given some thought to that. If the government's worst scenario is realised, God forbid, and up to 60% of Australians are affected, it could, and you do the sums yourself, it could, and for a community of our size of 52,000, it could in fact, God forbid, lead to some 300 deaths. That's a lot, and would challenge our Chevra Kadisha, but I'm sure that they're giving that some consideration. We didn't, and Bruce, we did not mention weddings. I know that we have someone here online from Yerushalayim at the moment who no doubt is concerned about weddings. And she's just put it up now. This is, so Abigail, this is not halachic, but can I say that we are reluctant to cancel weddings. Weddings by and large, unless there are dire circumstances, should not be cancelled. But a wedding, by the way, Abigail, means having 10 people. It does not mean having, I know we all go to weddings of 400 and 500. That's actually not required. And my wife's grandparents got married with a group of 10 people when they stepped off the ship into Melbourne. They had 10 people who they didn't know, got together, and on that day, or I think it was that day, had their wedding amongst a group of people, and they distributed some honey cake or something. That's all they had. Weddings should preferably not be cancelled if it can be avoided, but it does not mean that you have to have a large wedding. As I said, minimum of 10 would do it, including the rabbi and Adim. So you'll want to make sure that at least you've got some Shomer Shabbat people amongst the group. So Paul had asked, so you don't need a room. I have to check. I'll go back to that Gemara because I'd made a comment that Evie had said people came out of the street onto their apartment, their places. In Crown Heights, by the way, there are a bunch of matchboxes and they basically sit next to each other. So if you come out the street, you're almost touching your next door neighbour. Is that considered a minyan? I don't think you have to be in a room because we know that people go on holidays, sometimes to perform minyanim together out in the paddock. So it doesn't need to be a room. It would simply be a question of how far apart you need to be for it to be counted. And I'm not sure what that would be. There are some measurements that can vary depending on whether it's line of sight, so that gives the appearance of being a group. So I don't know. And Howard, thanks very much. As being an infection, yes. Okay, thank you. And Debbie, you're welcome. And Ellie, definitely if there's a minyan in town, even if you're not present, please find out if someone's saying Kaddish. But otherwise, in that sheet I'm going to send out, it has the link to the Chabad online. Just put down the name and they'll try to organise that someone somewhere in the world will say Kaddish for 60 days. That person may have 15,000 people in mind, I don't know. David asks about communal fasts and Tehillim. David, that has been our typical response, and that's a response we've done over millennia. David, you'd be well aware that the Gemara in Tanis, in fact, is all about fasts because of the community being in a troubled time, particularly in those days without sufficient rain. However, communal fasts and Tehillim would have to not be face-to-face, but there's nothing that would stop us from doing like we've done now with a communal shiur. Nothing would stop us from getting people together online and doing Tehillim at the same time. A fast could definitely be called, provided that all those who are fasting are able to do so safely. Clearly, those people who are unwell for other reasons other than corona need to be careful that they don't join themselves in a fast that may put them in peril. Sheva Brachas dinners, by the way, you don't need Sheva Brachas every night. So Abigail, thanks for asking that question. You do need one for the first night, and there are some restrictions. But if you don't have a minyan for Sheva Brachas, all but one bracha can still be said, interestingly enough. The bracha that can't be is so I have to check. I have to check. I've got a little siddur I've produced myself where I've listed the bracha that can't be said. There's one bracha that can't be said if you don't have a minyan, but you have roiv, you have 6 people. If you have roiv, then the other brachas can be said. I'll have to check that for you. But Abigail, your young couple, no doubt, will have a rabbi who they can rely on and should ask a competent rabbi there. And Tommy, I'm not sure I understand the question about the introduction, reintroduce the issue of place. Just give me a heads up on that one, please.
Right, well, we talked about, I'm bothered about your definition of place being a room.
A roof, did you say?
A room.
A room.
R-O-O-M.
Yep.
Sorry. The whole point is today's technology is so radically different. It was never imagined, right? So the concept of a person standing in a doorway, not being regarded as in the place, I can understand that. But it can be the same as a person who is attending a minyan via using this Zoom system, right? Where they are on mute instead of participating, right? So that's the same analogy of being in a doorway. My children, my grandchildren in Israel are now between the hours of 9 and 12 every day on a program called Google Classroom, where everybody who's attending the classroom is visible on the screen, including yourself as the teacher, and they are fully participating. I saw my grandson being asked a question, he raised his hand and he was picked out. Now, why can't we consider modern technology and the incredible crisis that we're faced, right? Why can't we interlink modern technology and say, well, the word place now means something different, or it includes a computer screen which can fit up to 20 people or something like that, and we can participate in davening in every way possible. You can't kiss a Torah, right? But somebody could lane it. There's no question about that. Those who want to say Kaddish after their loved ones, they're in a position to do so. Everything falls into place. All we need to do is change the definition of the word place.
I hear what you're saying. You make a very impassioned plea. However,
I can keep going.
No, great. However, it still ignores the fact that, in fact, we are actually not joined in the computer. It's actually a digital representation of us.
We are joined, Ronnie. That's not true. We are joined. I had to specifically put in a link to join to you. Right?
Hang on,
forget
Tommy.
That it's a series of numbers.
We are not joined. Our digital representation is joined, We are not. That's therein is the problem.
No, because that's the way you define it.
Right.
I feel very much joined to you at the moment.
Oh, that's thanks very much. This has come awful sudden, mate.
Your presence is a little bit too close.
Yes, a lot of people say that.
No, seriously. I mean, wires and reproduction of voice, it's a method of carriage. I think we just have to think about, and it's not nowhere near within my ambit of doing so.
Yes.
It's up for Rabbanim with far more knowledge than I have, but to consider the definition of place. It can change so much. It can bring meaning to people who are bedridden. They can participate in minyanim. There are so many benefits that can come of it. All we need to see is the modern way of doing it.
Yeah. I hear what you're saying. I still think it's a problem because I don't think I don't think we are physically all of us together through the computer.
We all put in the same code, Ronnie. Argue that.
We did. And by the way, I've just emailed you. I've just included in the chat those notes that I would refer to. So feel free to use those. I hear what you're saying, Tommy. I'm moved by your sentiment, but I have to say that halachically I can't seem to.
Why can't you just tell me you'll do some work on it?
Yeah, I'm happy to.
Rabbi, can I ask a question, please? Can you hear me?
Go for it, please.
I really miss actually saying Kaddish for my mum in a minyan.
Yes.
Now, if I ask someone else to say Kaddish for me, then I don't. That's great, but I don't feel like I've done enough. Mm-hmm. What can I do instead?
Ellie, an excellent question. The truth of the matter is, you can only do so much. However, as I said before, there are people who often ask someone else to say Kaddish because they're traveling or for whatever reason. Ideally, you should be doing mitzvot in memory of your mother. And a mitzvah, by the way, could be anything, helping other people. It could, by the way, be giving tzedakah. And ideally, you'll find someone, and in fact, I've sent you that link now. Sorry, I've sent you the document towards the end. There's that link to that Chabad online.
Thanks.
You should be finding an opportunity to pay someone for that service because of the concept of shliach shel adam kamoto, the emissary of someone. If you send as messenger, they are as effective as doing it as if you did it yourself. Okay, and this is one of those times when we rely on that. Give tzedakah, do charitable deeds. That is a great thing in fact, maybe greater. The worst thing to happen is that someone says Kaddish, but otherwise they're a no gooder and don't help anyone. That actually does nothing. You're better off doing good deeds and helping people and giving tzedakah and so on. That's very important, and someone can say Kaddish for you. Don't feel bad about it.
They didn't know my beautiful mum, though.
Yes, and your beautiful mum, no doubt. And unfortunately, I didn't either, but no doubt your beautiful mother will benefit from any good deeds you do.
I'm with Ellie.
Thanks. Thank you for very interesting shiur, very relevant.
Thank you. So, sure.
So do we reconvene in a week's time where you've done some more research?
Look, if there's some interest,
find something, Ronnie. Find something.
Yeah, but I should point out in 2 weeks' time is Hillel's regular shiur. Stay online with certainly on our Facebook page at St Kilda Shule's Facebook page, or sign up to St Kilda Shule. All of our shiurim are online. We have one starting tomorrow. A new weekly shiur starts tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. with our Chazan Brett Kay will start a new shiur online. Sign up to our newsletter. You'll be kept informed if you like, or to the Facebook page. But Hillel will resume this in 2 weeks' time. This is his time slot, and it's his shiur. He gives some very fascinating shiurim on a whole range of topics. But certainly sign up tomorrow at 10 a.m. to hear Brett. Next Monday, Rabbi Glassman has his regular Kabbalah shiur online, as I said, 2 weeks from tonight, Hillel will resume with his shiur. Feel free to join. Probably done enough for the time being, but I appreciate everyone's feedback, and thank you very much. I hope this is not being too much for you. Certainly, we've gone a lot longer than I expected. I hope none of you have fallen asleep in the meantime.
Thank you.
With that, keep doing mitzvot, do the right thing, and pray. And we're approaching now Nisan. The next month is ER, and ER stands for Ani Hashem Rofecha. The acronym, the first letters of the words I am Hashem who heals you. The month of ER, particularly Rosh Chodesh ER, should be a time when the entire world is healed by then. We're not very far away. Okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ronnie. It was a great shiur.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Most enjoyable.